Welcome to this online lesson on life on the trail. How dangerous was the Oregon Trail? The aims are to know the challenges of travelling west, to explain why some expeditions failed, and to explain the different factors that might make an expedition a success. Here's a do now task. What dangers and challenges might there be for migrants travelling in wagons? You can use the picture to help you. I'm sorry it's got that watermark on it, but it's still the best image I've been able to find to try and show this. Secondly, how might migrants be supported on their journey? Pause the video now while you attempt that task. Okay, hopefully we've recognised some of the features that might be dangerous and challenging. First of all, have a look at the mountains. Those are the Rocky Mountains and potentially the Sierra Nevada that they would have to cross in order to get west. Whatever way you cut it, there were very few particularly well built roads through this region. And when I say built roads, I really mean just more trails that had been beaten somewhat into a trail by the passage of many wagons. Especially the early pioneers would have found that there virtually were no roads to speak of at all. Another thing that you might notice is the weather. Although it's reasonably decent there, the weather is incredibly changeable in the mountains. You've also got the dangers of swollen streams as well, and very little food to eat. You only really had what you could find on the trail, what might have been planted on advanced parties, or what you could carry in your wagon. Some people among you may have noticed there are a couple of Plains Indians on horses. Now, that's an interesting one, because the Indians could indeed be a danger to these settlers. At times of greater friction between the US government and settlers and the Indians, yes, there could be attacks upon them. And yet, Indians were probably more likely to help people crossing the plains and the mountains rather than hinder them for much of the time that the Oregon Trail was in operation. So how might these migrants be supported on their journey? Well, I've given one example already with the Indians. However, in other ways, a lot of it is just down to whether or not they took the right preparations. For example, you wouldn't want to travel the Oregon Trail on your own. You would want to do it with an appropriate mix of people. You'd want to take the right animals, you'd want to leave at the right time of year, and you'd want to take the right sort of food. And food would have been one of the most important commodities that you took with you. There really was very little space on your wagons for any luxuries. So we're going to consider some issues about the Oregon Trail and why people were moving west, and then come to some sort of judgment as to how dangerous it was. Firstly, some keywords and terms. Cloak's compendium of annoying old-fashioned words that you need to know today comprises of migration, the movement of people from one place to another. Emigrant, someone who moves away. Immigrant, someone moving into an area. A push factor is a reason that forces or encourages someone to leave, whereas a pull factor is a reason attracting someone somewhere else. And manifest destiny. This is one that we're going to spend some time over. The belief that God wanted white people to take over the whole of America and make it civilized. Okay, so record and explain the key words, and then have a think. Is manifest destiny a racist idea? Explain your opinion. When you've done that, you can press play, but for now, press pause to complete those activities. So, is manifest destiny a racist idea? Well, the assumption that white people somehow have a right to take over the entirety of the American continent is basically a racist idea. It's not as if that continent was already empty. There were native groups of people already there who already very much had a sort of relationship with the landscape and had lived there for many millennia. So the idea that just by occupying it you were somehow civilizing it, well, it makes a lot of assumptions, doesn't it? This painting, Westward, the Course of Empire Takes Its Way, was paid for by the US government in 1860. The artist, Emanuel Leutzer, was asked to point a visual version of the idea of manifest destiny. An important skill for historians is the ability to infer, and we're going to be practicing that skill a couple of times in this lesson. What this is you look at the source, and yes, you try and get information from it, but using your own contextual knowledge, you try and extend it beyond the obvious. So this is where you can get information from the source that isn't immediately obvious within the source. And again, remember, this will require you to use a bit of common sense and a little bit of contextual knowledge as well. So what's going to happen is on the next screen, you're going to get the opportunity to look at a full screen version of this painting. You're going to have to note down some of the ways that manifest destiny is shown in this painting. I've put one way here, but I think actually the expectation could be that you will find several ways that this painting shows the idea of manifest destiny. So keep that in mind, and we're going to have a look at a big version of the picture now. Okay, here's the big version of the picture. Pause the video when you're ready and make some inferences from it. How does this show manifest destiny? Alright, we're going to extend our studies of this picture a little bit now as well. So you can see a big version of it now. Describe between 2 and 6 features of the painting. What can you see going on? Then secondly, take one example from the painting and explain how it suggests that manifest destiny was a good idea. Remember, this is very much painted from the Western or European perspective. Then why do you think that the US government paid to have this painting made? And lastly, explain how this painting gives a misleading impression of what the plains were like. So pause the video while you complete those follow-up tasks. Right, I'll now identify some of the features in the painting. The sunlight. This makes the plains look golden and exciting. So it's this idea that this is a land of opportunity. The waving man makes people look eager to move. It's that sort of pioneering spirit that people would have referred to. Men, women and children, all of them are travelling west. It shows that people were taking their entire families to start a new life. There are mountains, plains and forest. This shows the variety of landscapes that these settlers and migrants would have experienced. There are also guns. This suggests that there will be violence. But against whom? There are other things to notice as well. Just below the sign that's just appeared, you can see a broken wagon wheel and a skeleton, suggesting some of the dangers of crossing. Also, there was a cross on the picture. Perhaps you saw it. This suggests that it was Christianity that was moving west as well. Poor people. This suggests that people who moved were looking for a better life. So hopefully you've been able to take one of those examples or an example of your own and explain how it suggests that manifest destiny was a good idea. But why did the US government pay for this to be made? Well, perhaps it could be because they're trying to encourage people to move west. Perhaps they're trying to put across this idea that the US government would one day rule the whole of the American continent, as in fairness they now do. It's trying to encourage that sense that there was a right for white people to move west. So how does this give a misleading impression of what the plains were like? Well, although it does hint at some of the dangers with the guns and the skeletons and the broken wagon wheels, it does give it a misleading impression of what it was like to try and travel there. For example, we are talking about colossal distances, people travelling literally thousands of miles. I don't know whether there are many places on the plains where, or on the journey rather, where you can see the great plains and all the grasslands and the trees and rocky outcrops and mountains all in one go. Maybe there are, but I would think that was pretty rare. Another thing is the mountains appear to be behind the people. Well, is it because they've just crossed the Rocky Mountains and arrived in Oregon? Well, that could be the only real reason why the mountains would be behind them. And yet I wonder what the picture would have looked like if these people were just facing up to what the mountains looked like as they arrived. Surely an awful lot more intimidating. We're now going to consider some of the reasons why people migrated, and this relates to push and pull factors. While very much a geographical concept, it can be useful for our understanding of people's motivations in history too. Your tasks then. Which of the following are pull factors attracting people to another place and which are push factors forcing people to move? Sort them into a table of push and pull factors. Here you go. Pause the video now while you complete that task. Alright, so cities in the east were very crowded and disease-ridden. This is something that pushed or forced people away. Cities in the west were quiet and cleaner. This is something that pulled people there. Indeed, there were very few cities to speak of at all. People were needed to do jobs in the west. Okay, that's another pull factor. That would have been attracting people to fill those roles. There were too few jobs in the east, so 25% of people were unemployed in the year 1837. That's a push factor. It's forcing people away from the east. People believed in manifest destiny. That's very much a pull factor. It's that idea that they're doing something that's going to be for the good of the nation. 1849, gold was discovered in the West. That is very much a pull factor as well. People were attracted by the idea of riches. In fact, I should say that gold was more discovered in 1848, but the rush to get there was in 1849. Poor people saw the chance of a new life in the West. That's very much pulling them towards the West because it's seen as a land of opportunity. Safe routes have been found to help people make their way west. Again, this is something that's attracting them there. Rather than being forced out, they're actually seeing it as a reasonable and possible thing to do. The government gave people money to encourage them to move west. Again, the prospect of getting financial rewards was more of a pull factor. And then the government reports made the West look manageable to get to. And again, that is something that attracts them there. So you should have noticed there are far more pull factors than there are push factors. And this is very much a common theme. The idea of moving west was usually based upon an optimistic idea of a better life attracting people out west, rather than necessarily some sort of catastrophe forcing them out there, although economic hardship and bad conditions of the cities were a couple of those examples. So the Oregon Trail, this was the main route west from 1836 onwards. As you can see on the map, it starts in the east, or rather in the central United States, in Independence, Missouri, and then it heads up through Nebraska, and there's a series of different landmarks along the way. Notice how many of them are simply rocks. Well, this is because they genuinely were distinctive rocks. Independence Rock, for example, is roughly the halfway point of the Oregon Trail. The idea was that if you had reached Independence Rock by Independence Day on the 4th of July, there was still enough of the summer left for you to cross through the rest of Wyoming, Idaho, and through into Oregon, which would involve the hardest stretches of the journey going through the Rocky Mountains. So that is the route of the Oregon Trail, and here's what we're going to do with that information. On your own copy of the map, and I've included a link in the description to one that you can download yourself, I'd like you to add and draw on the route of the Oregon Trail. Notice where it crosses through the states and use this as a guide for drawing it on so you can make it as accurate as possible. You might also want to add on some of these landmarks: Courthouse Rock, Soda Springs, Fort Bridger, and perhaps most crucially Fort Laramie, which is a very famous landmark itself. Thirdly, I meant secondly, migrants had to contend with hunger, disease, swollen rivers, high mountains, and ferocious weather on their journey of many months. If there were so many risks, why did 400,000 people risk the journey? Explained by referring to some of the push and pull factors that you'd looked at previously. Pause the video now while you complete those tasks. Okay, hopefully you've drawn an accurate Oregon Trail on your map and you've added some of the appropriate landmarks. Well, why did so many people risk this journey? Well, perhaps some of it is a naivety that they weren't really aware of what the risks were, or they just don't seem real until you're facing them. But I think a much bigger part of this is that this is very much a pioneering time when people were wanting to set out west and get land that would not have been possible for them if they'd stayed east. It's that sense that there is almost a duty to go there, but also that will provide a sense of opportunity. And so those pull factors are the ones that we really should be focusing on in terms of explaining why so many people took the risk. We're going to research, do some reading and some comprehension now. The following events, dates and consequences have all been muddled up. In fact, some of them are in the right place, but you still have to find out which ones. Sort them so that each event is with its correct date and consequence that follows on from it. Rather than drawing a table, you might prefer to just make these into full sentences. So where can you find the information? Well, you could certainly search for it online, maybe have a look for a GCSE revision website and find the section on Migration West. Or, if you are lucky enough to have a copy of the Pearson textbook with Sitting Bull on the front of it, you can find the information between pages 18 and 20. Once you've done that though, after reading through all the factors, or the reasons that encourage people to migrate west, which one do you think was most important? Explain why. And then, as a challenge, remember the picture from earlier in the lesson. Now that you know the facts, explain why this scene shows the idea of manifest destiny rather than necessarily the reality. Okay, pause the video while you do that. Right, let's go through some answers, see if we can unjumble these. I'm going to do this in chronological order, which is also a logical way to record your notes. Well, our first event is in 1836, and that's when the first migrants reached Oregon. And that started the Oregon Trail. Then there was a financial crisis in the USA in 1837, which led to unemployment and low wages. That meant that many people were desperate for a new start in the West. Then the Fremont Commission was commissioned to survey the Oregon Trail. The findings of that survey, they led to positive reports about how easy the Oregon Trail was to travel and convinced large groups of people to migrate west. How easy it really was, of course, is another matter. Then the last one, gold was discovered in the Sierra Nevada. This led to 100,000 people travelling to California in 1849 by land. And of course that was a big part of what was later called the Gold Rush. So those are your answers. Just make sure that you've got them all right. So which was the most important reason? Well, I would expect you would have chosen one of the pull factors, because those are the ones that tended to attract people out west and make those risks rather than necessarily being pushed or forced away from other circumstances. So why does that picture show an idea of manifest destiny rather than necessarily the reality? Well, I suppose the idea of manifest destiny was about being attracted out west, and the painting really shows that in quite a powerful way. However, it's not necessarily the reality. It doesn't tell us about the reasons why people are out there or necessarily what they're planning on doing when they get out there. And even when they do get out there, well, that's a bit of an assumption, because actually many people did not. I'm not saying that the majority of people who travel the Oregon Trail died doing it. Absolutely not. The vast majority made it. But a significant minority did succumb to different difficulties on the way. So, in order to prevent coming to a rather sticky end, people who took part in a wagon train needed to prepare properly. So what did a wagon train need? To be successful, migrants needed to plan for the following. They needed to set off from Missouri in spring to give the time grass to grow to feed the animals. If they set off too soon, then the animals would not have sufficient grass on the route to build up their strength for the really hard parts of the journey through the mountains. They had to cross the Rocky Mountains and Sierra Nevada just before the snow fell. If they got stranded there, then that was probably going to be the end of them. They needed to take enough food to live on. Salted pork which rots slowly was one favoured item. But there was very little possibility that they would be able to find enough food on the trail. They also took oxen typically. Occasionally people would take horses, but these are quite expensive animals and they relied on a lot of high energy food. Oxen, on the other hand, are slow and reliable animals that can survive on the grass that you would find by the side of the trail. But they do travel very slowly at 3 kilometers an hour, so time was tight if you were going to travel by oxen. And a group of migrants with useful skills should be assembled before you leave. So you should have some hunters for supplementing your food, trappers as well who might be able to supplement your food and provide fur and other items, carpenters for repairing broken wagons, fishermen again for providing food, and also women were really valued in this for their role in caring for children that they would take along and to help look after the migrants, particularly in a medical sense. So your task: add these factors labels to a picture of a wagon or as a mind map. I've included a link to a picture in the description if you want to use that one. Number the needs from 1 to 5 in order of priority. Explain your choice for the most important. And then explain the consequences of neglecting or not doing any of the above plans. Okay, pause the video now while you complete that. Alright, so let's consider it. I don't know what your orders of priority are, but perhaps one of the top ones should be taking enough food to live on. Doesn't matter what time of year you leave if you starve on the way. But what are the consequences of neglecting or not doing any of the above plans? Well, if they set off from Missouri too early, there won't be enough food to support the animals by the time you get to the mountains. If you set off too late, you won't be able to cross the mountains before the snow arrives. And that basically brings us on to the second one. If you don't manage to cross the mountains before the snow arrives, you will get stranded there. If you run out of food, then you will have nothing to eat and you will starve. Unless you decided to eat one of your fellow migrants. Yeah, I'll come back to that. Taking enough food to live on. Well, if you don't take the appropriate amount of food and you don't take enough, then you're going to run out of food and starve anyway. What about if you take the wrong sort of animals? Horses were great, they were very strong, they were very fast, but if you didn't have enough oats and other high energy foods in order to feed them, then the likelihood is it was going to run out of energy before you got there, get too skinny, get too weak, and so forth. Oxen are very much multi-purpose animals. You can even use them to do some ploughing when you get out there. And lastly, assembling a group with the relevant skills. If you had too many children, for example, on your journey, then that's a lot of mouths to feed who are not going to be doing much to contribute to the rest of the journey. If, for example, you haven't got a carpenter or some sort of handyman with you, then and your axle breaks on the journey, then you're basically stuck there until someone turns up who does know what they're doing and they've got the time to help you. So it was really important not to try and sit out on your own and make the journey. Let's consider some typical problems. One of the first is Indian attacks. Migrants demanded protection from the government from Indian attacks. And while this fear was widespread, actually the Indians were far more likely to help migrants than harm them. One wonders how many migrants mistrusted the Indians and therefore missed out on help, or possibly caused misunderstandings and violence through this mistrust. Also, cholera. Safe campsites were often established by rivers. People used these for drinking water and for going to the toilet. It would be unfortunate if you fill up your water bottles only to see someone tipping their chamber pot into the water just upstream of you. So what is cholera? Well, it's a bacterial disease that affects the gut. It causes explosive diarrhea, lovely, dehydration and muscle cramps, and usually after that, death. Yeah, you really don't want to get cholera. Then there's drowning. We take for granted these days that bridges are everywhere, but you've got to remember that they had to be built at some point. In these pioneering times, bridges were very few and far between. It was far more often you would have to ford a river just by completely driving through it. If you had timed this wrong, or if you could not find a safe place to cross, your wagon might be swept away, you might lose your animals, you might lose your children. Put it this way, it wouldn't be a good time. And lastly, accidents. Being crushed under a wagon wheel would be a pretty nasty end, and it would be more common than you'd expect. If something slipped or it fell down on a rock or it tipped over, then you could easily be crushed and killed. Alternatively, there were a surprising number of accidents with firearms. Many of these migrants were not used to handling firearms and they bought them for protection. Think about the American obsession with guns these days. It kind of dates back to this period where people were regularly carrying guns very much as tools and where they were mistrustful of others, including the government. Well, if you were inexperienced with a gun, you might end up shooting yourself or a loved one, which would hardly be the idea. About 20,000 people are thought to have been killed on the Oregon Trail. You'll notice that I've included a little green and black screenshot from an old computer game at the top. This was a computer game from the 1980s called the Oregon Trail, and one of the very first kind of story-driven computer games that ever there was. It was notoriously difficult to win, and maybe that tells us a little bit about what it was like on the Oregon Trail in itself. Your tasks then. Firstly, summarise the dangers in your own words. Make sure you don't miss any of them. Then, between 1834 and 1868, about 800,000 people travelled the Oregon Trail and 20,000 died. So what percentage died? And then, given this percentage, how dangerous was the Oregon Trail? Explain your view with examples. Okay, pause the video here and then complete the tasks. Press play when you're ready. Alright, hopefully we've got a summary of the dangers which includes all the key examples. So, did you work out that sum? The answer that you should have come up with was 2.5%. So, given this percentage, how dangerous was the Oregon Trail? Well, it's tempting, isn't it, to say, well, not that dangerous, only 2.5% of people who travelled on it died on it. Alright, well, that's fair enough. It is a low percentage, and you were far, far more likely to pass through safely on the Oregon Trail than you were to die. But just consider this. If I gave you a bag of 100 sweets and then told you that 2.5 of them would kill you, would you eat that bag of sweets? Well, I think you'd probably have to be either very hungry or very, very desperate for those sweets. Now we're going to consider when a shortcut is not a shortcut. Have a look at this diagram. The Oregon Trail is the trail in purple that's going along the top, the northern part of the map. Then you can see that there is a part that comes off of the Oregon Trail in green called the California Trail. This led south across the Sierra Nevada to California rather than Oregon. Makes sense. Now, if you wanted to go to California instead of Oregon, there may well be a more direct route. However, the route that's marked on there as the Hastings Cutoff is deceptive. Although the route between Fort Bridger and the Ruby Mountains is, as the crow flies, shorter, have a look at those mountains that it has to cross. Notice that actually the majority of those mountains are avoided by the Oregon Trail. Look as well at how snaking a route it was. Even though it's closer as the crow flies, it's actually over 100 miles longer in reality. And so this is where a shortcut is not a shortcut. And if you get this wrong, the consequences can be dire. A new subheading then, and a case study on when things went wrong. The Donner Party. Alright, this is pretty grisly stuff, so brace yourself. The Donner Party was a group of around 300 migrants who travelled west in May 1846. They were led by the Donner brothers and included a larger than average proportion of women and children and the elderly. Remember what we said about preparing properly and not taking too many women, children and elderly with you because you needed enough tradesmen to fix things. The journey went well until they reached the Rocky Mountains. The Donner brothers convinced about 80 of the party to split off and try a shortcut. That was the Hastings cutoff I've just shown you. And that was a shortcut that had been described in a guidebook. That would cut 550 kilometres off the route. Except it didn't, did it? What they didn't know is that the route had never actually been tried. The surveyor just thought that it would work. Lacking a worn road, safe river crossings and places to feed and rest the animals, the party became hopelessly delayed. By the time they reached the Sierra Nevada in mid-October, winter was fast approaching. The party became stranded in the snow and their food ran out. Their animals died and they were eaten. And then their people began to die and they too were eaten. I don't think we can really imagine the desperation that these people must have suffered in order to do that. But it is said that the very, very hungry and starving almost literally go mad with it. And so this desperation could have driven them to do something just so dreadful. About half of the 80 people who tried the Hastings cutoff died. They were frozen to death and many of them were eaten. If you want to find out a bit more about this and see a bit more of a graphic description, and that's only really for the very strong-stomached of you, I have included a link to a video in the description. So your task, summarise the events under the headings. Who was involved? When did the event happen? Where did the events happen? What went wrong? And why did it go wrong? Then secondly, consider who was to blame. Is it the Donner brothers themselves who led that expedition to the cutoff? Is it the surveyor who suggested it? Or is it just bad luck? Explain your choice. Okay, pause the video now, and if you want to see the other video as well, it's in the description, but press play again when you're ready to continue. Okay, so who was involved? Hopefully we've identified the Donner brothers and a party of 300 people, which later split off into a group of 800 people. So when did it happen? May 1846 was when they set off, but it's in the winter of 1846-47 that things really go wrong. Where did the events happen? Well, initially on the Oregon Trail, but later on the Hastings cutoff, or this shortcut on the way to California. What went wrong? Well, they got delayed. The route was not as passable as it seemed. It was also longer than it had been advertised to be, and so they got delayed and they didn't manage to cross the mountains before the snows arrived. So why did it go wrong? Well, partly it's because the Donner brothers hadn't prepared properly. They didn't have an appropriate mix of people there. Partly it's because they made an assumption about the cut-off route that they were using, and they were inexperienced, as were many migrants who crossed there. And partly it was just bad luck. The snows could not have fallen at a worse time. So who is to blame? That's very much your opinion. But it could be the Donners for not preparing properly. It could be the surveyor who basically was just working on guesswork and didn't make that clear. And it could be a combination of the two and bad luck. Whatever you've chosen, just make sure you've explained it and justified it. We're going to do some source skills now. Right, first of all, I'm going to make a bit of an apology here because this is in very poor taste and real people actually died. However, my students often find it helpful to remember the Donner Party in this way. Moving to the country, going to eat a lot of people rather than meet a lot of people would be one. And another, well, you might recognise that particular culinary delight at the bottom as Donner meat. Yes, Donner meat is rather mystery meat that you can buy in a kebab shop. And if that helps you remember the rather, shall we say, disgusting meat that they had to eat on the journey, then so be it. I'll say no more on that, but if it helps you remember, all to the good. Here we have source A. Captain Fullen was a member of the rescue party who found the Donners after the winter snow started to subside. Captain Fullen, who led one of the rescue parties, described what he found when he reached the Donner Party in February of 1847. A horrible scene presented itself. Human bodies, horribly mutilated, legs, arms and skulls scattered in every direction. At the mouth of the tent stood a large pot filled with human flesh cut up. It was the body of George Donner. His head had been split open and the brains extracted. Yum. So, read source A. Be warned, it was pretty grisly, wasn't it? What information from the source backs up something that you already know? What new information does the source give you? What might make Captain Fullen's description a trustworthy source? Give an example and explain why you believe it. And what might make this source untrustworthy? Give an example and explain why you doubt it. And lastly, what could a historian do to try and check how truthful this source is? Pause the video now while you attempt those tasks. Alright, so there are various things that kind of back up what we already know. You should already know that the Donners of the Donner Party, some of them resorted to eating some of their party to survive, and that source certainly backs it up. What about new information? Well, it gives us a bit of a better sense of how the tents were laid out and what the scene was like there and just how desperate things must have got. How can we consider this trustworthy? Well, there is a description of humans having been eaten, and we know this to have happened. But not only that, we might consider this trustworthy because Captain Fullen was actually there and experienced these things, and it makes sense that he would have written something down about it. But why might it be untrustworthy? Well, perhaps Captain Fullen is trying to exaggerate this for gory effect. Maybe he figures this will make his account more popular, perhaps he's selling it to the newspapers. Also, perhaps there's supposedly a little bit of self-aggrandizement here. In other words, he's trying to make himself look like more of a hero. And that might make it untrustworthy. But how could we try and check how this source might be trustworthy? Well, we could compare it to other accounts. For example, there were around 40 survivors of the Donner Party, and we could check their accounts to see how true it was. Indeed, some diaries survived, and these do recount the times when they ate their first bodies. And you wouldn't believe it, but it was Christmas dinner. I wonder if they were aware of that. Probably yes. So, by way of a final summary, let's see if you can answer these questions. Firstly, give 3 to 5 examples of dangers on the Oregon Trail. Then explain the meaning of the term manifest destiny. Then describe what happened to the Donner Party and explain what the Donner Party did wrong in order for that to happen to them. If you're unable to complete any of these tasks, it's worth reviewing parts of this video. If you can, record your answers now and you can pause the video. However, that is the end of the lesson. I'll say thank you very much for watching, and if you found that useful, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Thanks very much and goodbye.